Okay, well, welcome to today's platform sync conversation. So let's see, the first thing we have is a status update. I can give mine. Very recently started looking into a build kit front-end prototype that was provided by, I forgot the author's name exactly, but I believe it's somebody from Bloomberg. Went through some of that, made a couple call outs, one for the implementation side of things with regards to exporting functionality and how that is not being used in this prototype because of the interactions necessary with what's called the LLB, I believe. So there's probably something that we'll need to discuss there. I plan on bringing it up tomorrow in the implementation subteam sync and maybe kind of go through some options to try to see what's best there. Outside of that, from a platform's perspective, I also looked at I guess the interface for how you would configure or execute this from the Docker CLI perspective. I think the proposal that I have is to try to leverage the project TOML file and format and simply add some essentially like a header comment to let the Docker build kit know what I guess what front end to use, right? And in our case, the Buildpacks front end. So it's very much a proposal, probably something worth exploring a little bit more in detail. I know we have to gather a lot of build kit context within the project as a whole. So I am hoping that, through some of this exploration, we could get, basically a meeting set up so that we could kind of discuss build kit specifically as a whole across multiple subteams. So probably going to punt that over to in office hours, but still very much in the works. Okay, I think that's it for me here. Any status updates from anybody else?
Yeah, I guess I've just been continuing to try and get asset packages to a place where it can all be merged in. And I think that's actually getting pretty close. And I'm hopeful all of the functional code will be done by the end of this week and that I can then spend some time making sure that it gets refactored and is code that people actually want to work with. So there's quite a bit of repetition between what I'm doing and some of the stuff in build packages with small differences. So some opportunity there.
Is it called build packages? Yeah, build packages, right? Not stack packs. Got it.
Yeah.
Do we know where the spec stuff is for this? Have those spec PRs been created and or merged in?
Have not been merged in, but they're there. I think they might need a little, I should go over them after this is done to make sure that I've gotten everything, but
Okay.
I don't actually think it changes the spec that much, right? Since it's like a totally new edition. Which is actually kind of nice.
Cool. That sounds good. All right. Any other status updates?
Just on the I guess some of the duplication that you mentioned with build packages. I flagged an issue on the life cycle for discussion, which I think will lead us down the path of talking about how some of that code might be consolidated. So basically, we had an ask a while back about whether it's possible to export a tarball. Oh, bye, Dan.
Okay, I'm not sure what happened there. Should we give him a second? All right, how about this? We circle back if and when he does show up. Sound good?
Yeah, that sounds good.
All right, let's see. We have a standing item for release planning to update the docs. I'm not entirely sure what that may be referring to. I'm assuming Dan might have added it. We'll skip that as well for the time being. Okay, we've got a couple items that require some discussion. Okay, am I sharing the right screen? Do you see the GitHub? Cool. All right, so let's see. I think we've got this verbose mode activated GGCR issue. I think we've discussed it in the past. Still waiting for Dan to provide a little bit more context or information here. So there's not a lot of traction there. There's move analyze phase before detector. This is based on an RFC. I'm not sure. Oh, there you go. We have Dan. Dan, do you know why this issue requires some discussion?
I think it's just about how we manage the difference between running the two phases and what order they get run in, and how we're going to roll that change out, right?
So wouldn't this be as simple as looking at the platform API version supported, and then based on that platform API version, determining in which order they are executed? Or am I missing the question concern?
Yeah, I mean, I think that like yeah, I don't think it's a bunch of work, but I just figured it was something that we want to like bring up and potentially surface to other people, right? Potentially something that needs some documentation, probably something extra in the release notes, maybe. But
I guess maybe I'm trying to gather why we think this is special versus any other change to the platform API. Right, so we have platform API 05 or 06 right now, right? And I'm presuming that this is coming on 07. Pulling it up right now. Okay, it doesn't have a milestone set to it yet. But assuming that it's 07, right? At least for this issue for PAC, right? It would just be a matter of saying that we change the order of execution based on the platform API version. And I feel like maybe we're tying too many things to it, like documentation and all this other stuff, which is probably like something that we could take on elsewhere. So for instance, like the migration guide, right? That would take into consideration like letting everybody know, like, hey, this is the platform API change. Maybe even a blog post, right? As a proposal for something that the implementation writes as to why we're changing the phases might be nice to have. But I'm not sure that I see the association to this particular issue in PAC, and I guess why we would block or need to have further discussion in this context.
okay, all right.
Does that make sense? Like, I want to make sure I'm not missing anything there.
No, it makes sense. I mean, I guess. Yeah, okay.
So this is more, it's still a blocked item, right? Based on the platform API version that has this feature. And Natalie, do you know if this is scheduled for 07? Because it's not an 06, right? I would assume.
Yeah, it's 07. I'm sorry if this was already discussed and I didn't pay attention, but from the user's perspective, like on the one hand, the phases and their order of execution is kind of hidden from the pack user. But at the same time, by flipping the order, we are enabling some extra functionality that may be good to call out. So I don't know if that should be connected to this issue, or it's more from a documentation perspective. Like, you might see, failures if, you don't, I don't know, the build would fail faster, right? If you didn't provide correct credentials or something like that. I don't know if that's notable enough to warrant, like, I don't know, telling people about it, but maybe it folds in with stack packs.
I guess, what do you mean by that? Folds in with stack packs?
I guess some of the stuff that we're enabling are things like, validating mix-ins. So it kind of feels like this issue is really like a stepping stone to those other issues.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, but I don't know. I guess I'm still of the opinion that this issue for the execution order is very simplistic and well encapsulated, right? And I think the greater scope of what it enables, like what other feature sets we have, if you're thinking from a life cycles perspective, what the migration of that looks like, those are all very separate to this particular issue.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I think that this was something that I added a while ago, just when there was some uncertainty about what the actual, like, when this was going to be coming out on the life cycle, what the API was going to be that we were going to be like switching on, etc. So
Cool, that makes sense. All right, so I'm adding this comment and I'm going to go ahead and remove the discussions needed for this. All right, so we got one. I think, Dan, you were out while we kind of called you out on this one. Still waiting a little.
yeah, sorry.
All right, just want to make sure, like, if there
Um,
wasn't anything that prevents you from adding some context there.
No. Could we just assign that issue to me, maybe? That would make this a little easier
Cool,
for me to keep track of.
there you are. There. All right.
Thanks.
Moving on to this unable to release pack, blah, 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 to the x86 architecture. This is really concerning to me on many levels, because I'm not sure that the dependency that we have is the appropriate dependency. What I mean by that is this long sleep Golang deb, right? Like, it's obviously not the official Debian installation. And I did a little bit of research and found that there's nothing actually preventing Go, like there were some changes on x86 but it was more towards the compilation of those of certain outputs, but not the execution there within, if that makes sense. So
Right.
I guess I'm still trying to like frame or like gather this like big picture of why we have this dependency on this one individual that it seems like they've made a choice, right, to remove or deprecate that functionality, and whether we could bypass that to find official Debian packages, because I know that there's at least a Golang team on the Debian PPA, or on the other side, quote unquote, build it from source, right? And I don't know enough to like dive into those, but they seem fairly reasonable. But if I go and look for Go binaries, I will still find an x86 binary for it. So I think you broke up a little bit.
You'll find an x86 binary for it. Oh, sorry. I just said if I go and look for a Go binary, I'll still find an x86. Yeah, just like the fact that this works on x86.
Yeah. So here I'm still sharing my screen, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So if I go on here, and how did I really get to it? Like 386, right? Like
Yeah.
it does still exist, right? So I'm missing the association or disassociation presented where x86 or 386 is no longer being supported. I'm questioning who is no longer supporting it. Is it this intermediary individual that has the unofficial Debian package, or is it Go themselves, right? If it's just this individual, this intermediary, then can we get rid of the intermediary and go with a more direct solution?
Yeah. So from what I understand about how Ubuntu distributes packages, the problem is not that there is Golang that can be compiled on this architecture. Problem is that they force you to, they won't let you just like download arbitrary binaries during their build process, right? Their idea of how things should work is like you have a package that has a dependency that's declared in like our format, right? So it's a dependency on another PPA, and you can't have binary PPAs. Like I would love to just be able to take Golang, throw it in one of these archives and say, thumbs up, this definitely works. I already know it. But they force you to build stuff from source, right? And so the problem is that this other person is struggling to build Go from source on the build machines that Ubuntu provides for PPAs, right?
We know if other, like, because it sounds like almost like a whole ecosystem is being disrupted by this structure, right? Like, do we know of other projects that provide Linux 386 distributions or packages and what their solution is?
Um, no, I think we can probably, I think there's ways that we can get around this. It just, the problem is that we cut a release already, assuming that this would work. And if we want to go back and change it, we have to start doing something very different, where we probably cross compile for a different like architecture during our like launchpad or like the Ubuntu build system while it runs, right? So I think there's a way around this and we'll have to do it, but it will be large, right? There's not a small fix.
I guess maybe like the general question, right, is I think you brought it up, whether we still want to continue supporting this release. Did we ever get metrics, or do we have metrics on how many downloads this gets via Launchpad?
Yeah, I couldn't find anything. I don't think that they give you that info.
I'd really hate to just drop support, like I said, based on an intermediary. And I'd like to
Yeah.
research what others are doing, like I said, because it does seem like a big ecosystem problem. And so I find it difficult to imagine that everybody all of a sudden said, you know what, I'm not building x86.
Yeah.
At least
Yeah,
within
I mean,
our
it's like,
ecosystem, right? Like in Kubernetes, cloud native world, there's a lot of Go that goes around. We could look at Containerd, we could look at some of the Docker utilities, and see, like, a lot of them are definitely providing PPAs, right? And to see whether or not they're providing it for x86, and if they are, how are they still able to provide it?
yeah.
That's what I'd like to maybe take a look at. Does that make sense? So yeah, I mean, probably something to keep digging into, but to your point, I don't think there's a easy 1 hour solution. So I'll add some notes on here, right? That we probably want to look into that. Go binaries on x86. Cool. All right, I'll keep that open as a discussion needed because I feel like we're gonna probably circle back through it a couple times. All right, and I think that takes us to the end of discussion needed. Okay, next, RFCs. We have a few. We could start at the bottom. Package refactoring. Do we know what the status of this one is?
Oh yeah, I will right after this go in and remove those binaries that we have. And that's the end of that discussion, I think. But
All right. Next, what did we have? Project descriptor, domain RFC. This one seems like it's in FCP. Anything that we want to discuss here? Okay, so we're actually going with this underscore thing, which is really interesting. Overall, I like it, but it's still all weird. I think the only thing left on this one is to create issues for it. Do we have issues to create for this? Have to update the parsing.
Yeah. Isn't something that's spec'd, right? So.
It is spec'd, right? And I believe it should have a version associated to it. Yeah, so they've got the API up here.
Yeah. Okay.
Cool, so API 01 would, I guess, would be the default pre-existing format. And this would be 02. Cool, that seems good. Last but not least, pack cache options. I know I created this thing, but it's largely based on your proposal, Dan. Have you had a chance to look at this one by chance?
Yeah. So I've read it over and honestly, I feel like it's nice. Like, I think that the UI is really good and really extendable. Just kind of like exactly the two things I was kind of worried about, right?
Cool. So I
The
think
only thing is
go ahead.
the smallest nit is like the separators that we use that like Docker uses is traditionally commas. I don't really actually care if we use semicolons, but
Yeah, I have no hard stance on that. Commas just seem to me like they're more common for list items, right? So therefore, I could imagine that a certain flag you or a certain option, I should say, you may want to provide multiple values, in which case we'd want to use commas, but that's probably something worth at least noting. So if you don't mind adding the comment, I could add that statement.
sure.
Cool. And I think we have some to-dos based on like drawbacks, right? Like a slightly more complex UX is kind of what I'm thinking there. And then alternatives could be the idea of having a flag for almost all of this, right? Like a shit ton of flags.
Okay, cool.
But cool. I'll definitely work on trying to get this a little bit past the draft state at least. Any questions on this one? Cool. All right, moving on. See, so we've done RFCs, we've done discussions needed. Okay, we have a couple items here. I think some of these might be from Micah, which I'm not sure like to what extent we could discuss them. But the first one, image util OS architecture aware constructor options. Does anybody know anything about that?
There was a recent change to image util that Micah contributed that I guess makes it easier to construct a new image for a particular operating system, architecture, or I think OS version. I'm not sure in what context he added that to the agenda, but it is there.
Is it a pull request?
Yeah, I think it's been merged. So it might be that Pack needs to make some changes to, or like not needs to, but could make some changes to use these new constructors. I'll link to the PR. It's very recent. Let me find it. Here. Put it in the document.
Cool.
It's just, I think we want to do this. For this caches.
Okay, so I added an action item to ping Micah and see whether or not there's something that Pack should be doing in this, but yeah, we can maybe circle back if something comes up that requires more discussion there. Oh, Dan dropped off again. I think he's having internet issues.
Sorry,
What happened?
getting absolutely wrecked by my internet connection. Okay. It's really frustrating.
Did you, I think you were trying to say something about this topic.
Oh, yeah, I was just gonna say, I think this solves some of the Windows cache images issues for us, and we don't have to do anything other than use a new version of image util.
Is there an issue for that, or did we have a workaround for it that we've implemented? Do you mind throwing that on the document there?
Do
Cool, and if there's nothing else there, we could talk about the image util registry test helper changes. So my understanding when I spoke to Micah about this was that there's essentially, I think right now, 2 separate implementations of the registry test helper or whatnot. And this option here that he's providing an image util is now something that hopefully we should be able to use in Pack and remove the duplication. So I'm going to assume that's what it is as well.
This will I know that this lets us run Windows acceptance tests for Windows on the lifecycle side without having a hosted runner.
What does that mean exactly?
Or sorry, a self-hosted runner. So like before, it was because of, I think it was the fact that you can't use the host network on Windows containers the way that we were pinging the test registry with localhost is just not going to work. And so this helper, I think it resolves the host for you so that you don't need to have a special configuration in Docker desktop that could only be achieved with a self-hosted runner.
Right, and this is the WCal, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, WCal.
Cool. That sounds really cool. I'm really interested in that one. I'll validate that and make any changes necessary to remove that dependency.
I think so. You can like strip a lot of code out of Pack now.
That'd be awesome. Cool, cool. I like how Micah gives us announcements via topics that we then have to decipher what they meant. No, but I do appreciate his work. All right, next, naming suggestions for build Docker host. Okay, I have a problem with this. Like, either I'm really misunderstanding this flag or there's I don't know, some other sort of limitation, but why do we need to differentiate the Docker host that Lifecycle uses versus the Docker host that Pack uses? Right? Like, why can't we just have the pointer to a Docker host and it be used by both pack and lifecycle? Like, I understand that maybe the lowest common denominator would be lifecycle because it requires a little bit of maybe special routing based on the fact that it's being executed in a container. But the fact that they're separate, and then you have like this idea, like I think right now the problem is like one of the users was trying to get Podman to work, right? And they were connecting to successfully via pack to Podman, but then they had to like pass an additional flag that says Docker host so that the lifecycle could also connect to the same Docker host, right? And again, my stance is I'm having trouble understanding why we can't unify these two.
I think maybe it's just coming from the fact that right now they're not unified, and that, like, you can see in this issue, cause confusion. It's not obvious that they're different. So I kind of feel like we should just implement it so that toggling this flag will affect both pack and the life cycle, and then we don't have to worry about, you know, a more complicated user interface.
Yeah, I guess the thing for me is maybe I'm thinking about it like from a president's perspective as well, right? Like the presidents should be like this flag, right? So if you pass this like Docker host flag, pack and lifecycle should both use this value. If it's not provided, then both should use the Docker host environment variable, right? And if that's not provided, then it should look for this socket that exists somewhere, right? Like a predetermined socket communication. Again, that's kind of like my train of thought there, right? And then if you provided a value, let's say in the environment variable, that pack is able to use, but lifecycle isn't able to use, then I think as long as we provide the right error messaging, we should be able to guide the user to providing a value that both pack and lifecycle could use, right? Like, because again, the one that lifecycle uses should be usable by both, is at least my initial kind of comprehension of it.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
So to move this forward, I think what I want to do is maybe add a discussions needed for this and get Micah to be present during these discussions so that maybe he could shed a little bit more light into some of the things that I just mentioned, right? They might not be accurate. Then also I would assume if it gets kind of like hairy, like or complex, the way that I just mentioned things, maybe it's worth having an RFC, right? That more or less explains exactly what we're attempting to do so that we could even further down the, down the line, we could document it better as well. Cool. Should discuss this. There you go. All right. Last but not least, actually, give me 1 second. Sorry, the beauty of working from home. All right. So review roadmap. We still do have a little bit of time here, I believe. So we can go ahead and review the roadmap. And I think what we're trying to gather from this initial pass is first acknowledge that the roadmap does exist, right? and then see if there's any sort of conversations we want to have around some of the topics on the roadmap. And lastly, if we find that anything is missing from this roadmap, how to essentially elevate that up to the core team members so that we could either get it on the roadmap next quarter for the year, because my understanding is that the core team is reviewing the roadmap quarterly just to make sure that we're all in line or in sync. So I'm just going to kind of give you a quick gist, right? So we want to do a lot more with documentation. I think we've gotten from a community this idea, right? Like this general idea that documentation needs a little bit more work. In the past, we've focused more on implementation since we were moving fast, and I think that was all understandable. But now I think it's time for us to kind of slow down and focus a little bit more on documentation. So there's that, right? There's the test API, right? So this is the idea that we should be able to run, like for the sake of being, explicit with an example, something like unit tests in the same exact environment that the build packs are being executed, so that when the final outcome or the final output is produced, it's been validated along with the same sort of dependencies, right, in same environment. So this is, again, kind of a pretty high ask from the community. I think this would also enable a better usability within a CI/CD pipeline. So I think that overall, a nice to have. Next thing is a spec refactor. So this is talking about kind of how the spec is currently structured and how it's currently written. It's not the easiest to consume. So we want to, collectively make changes to the spec and make it more consumable. I think the way that we're looking at it is we want people to be able to try a tutorial for the first time, right? Then when they kind of want to get something done, maybe look at any reference documentation, which is things that'll kind of give you the inputs and outputs. And then if they want to really know the laws, right, of everything that is happening and what the contracts are between different components, then that's something where they could look at the spec, right? But still be able to look at the spec in a very consumable way. So that's the spec refactor. The next one is configurability, right? So I think this is coming from the idea of maybe where it's a very heavy shift from something like a Docker file where you're able to tweak every single line and make any, specific change at any point in time during the build process. Build packs, for good reason, like are somewhat of a black box and they do a lot of magic behind the scenes. But the other side of things is maybe, there's certain use cases that developers may bring up that they want to be able to provide additional flexibility, right? So these could be things like configuring the build packs in a more reasonable manner, or even better yet, being able to provide things like labels and different environment variables in a more succinct way versus needing to use a very specific build pack, right? So that sort of stuff, right? So overall configurability and making the build process a little bit more accessible to the app developer. Okay, next thing we have is stack build packs, right? So this, if you've been in the community, you're kind of aware of, it's the idea of providing elevated operations during the build process to build packs. So think of like root operations that you could do on a stack. These sort of build packs would be special, and there's an RFC already for this. The work has already commenced on this. And again, should enable a lot of things like being able to install packages and so on at build time. Okay, next is a develop API. So this is speaking very similarly, very similarly to the test API, where developers are expecting things to be validated. In this one, app developers are wanting this sort of like what we call inner loop development iterations, where it means I'm in the middle of developing an application, right? And let's say, for instance, a Ruby application. I don't want to have Ruby installed, and I want to even further make sure that the same version of Ruby is installed in my development environment as the one that's going to be used during the build time for the final artifact, right? So it kind of ties all of that in, but in a way where you could more rapidly start the development process without having to have a local development environment to the extent that you had to do it before. Again, very high demand for this. There are some vendors. I think Tilt did a demo for something like this that I think like the way they did it was good, but even they were asking for a little bit more flexibility in certain aspects, which if we provide that, I think would give us a huge leg up. So that's the develop API. And then lastly is integration with the cloud native ecosystem, right? So on this one, we want to have a better integration with two ecosystems. One of them is the Kubernetes, clustering on the cloud type solutions. And then the other one is the local Docker experience. There's definitely some avenues that we're proceeding with this. I know that one of the things that comes to mind for the Docker integration is definitely the build kit front end. So that's something that we'll at least focus on to some extent. But that's more or less where everything's at right now. So those are all the things. I know I've, again, spoken way too much probably. Does anybody have any questions on any of that?
Yeah. So this is a little bit before my time, but the like test API is kind of like the idea that you will go through all of the build pack build processes and then run tests inside of the build container. Is that like the ask there?
I think that's pretty much up in the air in TBD because depending on the language, right? And depending on the type of test, right? So you could think of a unit test where it's typically operated at the source code level versus like an integration test that's operated on the outputs. I think a good example that I've seen out in the wild is the OpenShift S2I model, where they have like a pre-hook and a post-hook. And so you could, in any one of those, execute any arbitrary operation. And one of the things that some developers would do is put their, let's say, unit tests in the pre-hook, right? And basically they would run their unit test. If they don't pass, then nothing works, right? And then on the post-hook, very similarly, they would run tests on the binaries that were created at any point in time during the build process. And then if any of these scripts, pre-hook or post-hook, fail, the build fails as a whole. So it doesn't generate the final output of an image, right? So I'm using a very specific example, but I think none of it has really been set in stone and there is no RFC for this. But that's something that I kind of want to bring out there. I do
Okay.
know that there's certain languages, for instance, that would contaminate the build outputs, right? So for instance, Java, like if you instrument it, your classes would have like a whole bunch of additional overhead. And so you wouldn't want those generated classes to be your final output, right? Like you'd essentially have to reconstruct all that. So again, it might be, specific to languages, but I think we want to create a solution that applies to as many, possible options as possible. That was so weird. Yeah.
Okay. No, yeah, I got it. The question or my question already assumed that there was an architecture for how this would work, and that doesn't exist. Got it. Right
I
now.
think we're pretty much on the research or data gathering side of things right now.
Okay.
If you are interested, more than happy to get some data going. Yeah, research going. Cool. All right. Any other questions?
I guess I think that there has been maybe some talk about the develop API and what that would look like. But
Yeah, I think it's my understanding that the Potato team is actually working on a little bit of this, right? So there's two. The Potato team is looking for some solutions, and I know that they've done a little bit of research that they've published on Tilt and maybe even the Google Buildpacks, because the Google Buildpacks have a dev mode associated to them as well, right? So I think the build pack distributors or vendors, right? They're very much looking for a solution to this. So they might be the ones that kind of produce it. Because again, it may be also very specific to a language, right? Which they are the ones that have the most knowledge about. And we would just, Cloud Native Build Packs as a whole would just enable that sort of functionality.
yeah, I think that the initial pass was that they can definitely do stuff to make their build packs like enable development workflows, but that pack will also have to make some accommodating changes so that we're not uh, doing some of the more expensive processes. When we,
Totally agree. Yeah, what I found really like interesting and an experience that I really do like that maybe worth looking at for inspiration is VS Code. So if you don't use VS Code, it has a lot of like integrations or hooking into different like backends, right? So for instance, like if I'm on a Windows machine, it could very almost natively hook into a Linux backend. So where I run a Linux VM or Linux container, and then all my source code, everything is executed in a Linux environment, right? And then it has other things for like remote SSH and a whole bunch of different like what I call backends, but then also integrated with different languages and so on. And I think they've done really good in that. So having a similar architecture, I think would be awesome. If like, let's say for instance, Pack could have this sort of, let's say socket or RPC integration where you could communicate with it via some other front end or IDE, right? And it just like runs build packs and all this stuff. So like the IDEs themselves don't have to implement everything from scratch, but use some intermediary sort of solution like a pack or whatever other tool we may want to create for something like that.
Mhm. Yeah.
Very, very, hypotheticals over here, but
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's useful to just get some like different context on this. Since
So I think there's a slight action item from a maintainer standpoint in regards to the roadmap where I think we should label the issues that may be associated to roadmap items, like I think we've done in the past. So that way we could maybe even be able to filter and focus on those issues and make sure that we try to push those a little bit more focused than other issues. So I'll go ahead and also take that on.
okay, is that just going to be like we'll have some labels that correspond to just like spec refactor
Yeah,
throughout the project? Cool.
yeah,
Yeah. See, I'll help you apply those as soon as they exist.
sounds good. Awesome.
We could
All
use
right.
those for life cycle too.
Yeah, I'll try to use that label sync thing that we have in the community to like spread them throughout the whole project. Okay. All right. I know we're pretty much at time, so I think this is the first time we've gone this long. Any last words? Awesome. Well, thank you all for attending. See you next time.